Well, hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be in front of you today, even though it's a virtual conference. I wish you guys much success in what you're going to be talking about. My name is Peter Croal, and I'm a retired geologist. I worked for 32 years with the federal government in Canada, and a lot of that time with the Canadian International Development Agency, 20 years with that organization. And all my career has been involved in the extractive sector, impact assessment, and working with First Nations and indigenous peoples around the world. So I'm really happy to be with you today to talk about this issue of relaxing environmental governance in Northern Alberta, and is that a health risk for First Nations? And I hope that I can make the case that it really is. And to start off with, the very first thing to think about with First Nations in Canada is icebergs. And because what you see below the waterline is very similar to the issues with First Nations. You might be dealing with First Nations face to face and consider them an equal, but because of what I'm going to be talking to you about today, there are many underlying issues that have to be dealt with first before you can even get onto an equal playing field. So first, just a bit of background about First Nations, particularly in Canada. There's about 5 First Nations around the world, or indigenous peoples. And Canada has around 1 million. And what is of note is that we've got 54 language groups spread across over 600 First Nation communities. And the tragedy of that is that of these 54 languages in Canada, only 3 are expected to survive into the next century, which is a cultural issue and also links to health issues. Now, the HDI figure there is Human Development Index, is one of the lowest in Canada, and the HDI is a UNDP calculation that sorts out whether a community or an individual or a country has got good access to health, education, personal security, those sorts of things. And in Canada, for First Nation communities, it's very low. It's just a short look at North America before contact. So I'll be talking about the area in the northwest part of the country where the Chipewyan and the Cree and Dene nations continue to live. And also to set the tone for this conversation that I'm having with you is the philosopher Noam Chomsky has talked a lot about First Nations, and he says it's pretty ironic that the so-called least advanced people are the ones taking the lead in trying to protect all of us, while the richest and most powerful among us are the ones who are trying to drive society to destruction. And that's very, very true today. First Nations in Canada and around the world are the communities that are actually trying to stop development that is not sustainable, and they're kind of like our insurance policy for a better world. Going a bit deeper into this issue of icebergs and First Nations, in Canada, for those that aren't familiar with the First Nation history in our country, it's not very glamorous. I'm not very proud of what Canada has as a history with respect to First Nations. I'll be talking about that in a second. But over 500 years of contact now, and in Canada, we've got high rates of suicide and substance abuse and domestic violence, kids that don't complete school. A lot of it is to do with the residential schools. I will be talking about that for a minute or two. And even in my lifetime, I worked with Indian agents, and an Indian agent was someone who controlled all aspects of an Indigenous person's life in Canada if they lived on a reserve, to the point where an Indian agent had control over whether a person could get a job, could leave the community, could vote. All of these things were at the control of an Indian agent. He was sort of the lord and master of everybody who lived in the reserve. And you will see that all of this stems from policies that started in the 1800s to get the Indian out of the person. I'll be looking at that. So to get a sense of health, before we even talk about health issues and oil and gas in northern Alberta, we have to look at some of the stats in Canada that exist for First Nations on a monthly basis in Canada. So each month in Canada, you can see these statistics. It's not something to be proud of. On average, in Canada, it's about 10 times worse for First Nations people than it is for someone like myself, someone from European descent. So these are very serious issues that the government of Canada has been wrestling with for a long time, and it's very difficult to turn these numbers around. And the oil and gas issues in northern Alberta are amplifying this, and I will certainly talk about that in a few moments. All of these statistics that I just showed to you a moment ago, one can say they stem from our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who Canada became a country in 1867. And at that time, First Nations had communities all across the country, large territories of traditional hunting lands. And because of the expansion of Canada to the west through the use of railways, First Nations were seen as an obstacle to settling or civilizing the West and opening up the hinterlands to exploration and development. And so our Prime Minister had a few things to say about that. He said this: in order to educate them properly, we need to separate them from their families. Some may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. So the concept at that time was to develop residential schools. So Prime Minister also said this: when the school is on a reserve, the child lives with his parents who are savages. He's surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thoughts are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. So in the 1880s, that was the view of the government of Canada for Canada's First Nations, that they were savages and needed civilizing. The government hired one of its first, I guess you would call, ministers of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott. And so he was given the task of civilizing First Nations in Canada. And he had this position: I want to get the Indian problem solved. Our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. And there's no Indian question and no Indian department. Basically, Duncan Campbell Scott wanted to erase, eradicate, and remove all traces of Indian culture and Indian people from the face of the soil of Canada. And how did he do that? Residential schools. During the 1800s, 1900s, and the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. Whether by force or voluntarily, children of First Nations in Canada were removed from their parents and placed in residential schools. These schools were run by Catholics and Anglican churches, and over 160,000 children were placed in these institutions where they were told to read and speak English. If they practiced their indigenous culture, they were punished. And the other aspect of this too is that perhaps over 10,000 First Nation children died while in residential school care. They either died by suicide, starvation, or trying to run away and then freezing to death in the wilderness, trying to get home. So that left a legacy and a trauma in Canada, which Canada is still living with today. There isn't one Indian person, one First Nation person in Canada who does not know someone, who does not have a family member who has terrible memories of the residential school system. And remember, the residential school system purpose was to eradicate the Indian in the Indian. And that has left a health trauma, which the government is wrestling with, as well as First Nations all across the country. So getting closer to northern Alberta, and you're dealing with First Nations in those parts of the country, and you might be developing oil, you might be developing forest or energy projects, and you're now facing someone across the table who is a First Nation community member, and you are thinking that you've got an equal start with those negotiations, but those First Nations people are probably looking at you thinking, well, you're from the European culture, and over the last 500 years, you've tried to take our land, our language, our culture, our kids, and so it's not a very equal starting point for negotiations. In 2015, Truth and Reconciliation report was released. So it was a 7-year study to determine what were the effects of the residential school system on the health issues of First Nations, cultural issues, and their livelihoods. It was a very traumatic 7 years for thousands of the residential school system. And in 2015, when that report was released, I went on a healing walk with the head commissioner for that commission, and it was a very powerful, powerful day. In the center of that picture there, the gray-haired gentleman, is Senator Murray Sinclair, and he led the commission over 7 years and is living with the legacy of that. There were over 90 calls to action in that report dealing with health issues, education issues, cultural issues, some of which are being addressed, some of which have not seen the light of day yet. In the center of that picture is our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And when that report was released in 2015, he indicated that his relationship, the Government of Canada's relationship with First Nations, was his most important relationship. And I'm going to show you some evidence that perhaps might question that. However, the Government of Canada takes these issues very seriously and is trying to address the wrongs that have happened over the last 500 years. The question for us is this: is resource development in the form of oil sands in northern Alberta, is that the solution to poverty, cultural, and all of these traumas that First Nations live through in various parts of the country? And when you look at the statistics of First Nation youth today and the number of people in Canada that are First Nations, over half are under 25. So you've got this large population of up-and-coming youth who are looking for jobs, looking for opportunities, yet they're coming up against a wall of cultural, if you want to call it cultural genocide, coming up health issues, social issues, violence in the homes, things like this. It's a very difficult starting point for Indigenous youth. And or in Canada, there's probably going to be about $600 billion worth of investment over the next 10 years in the form of the extractive sector. And that includes oil sands, energy, forestry, and things like that. And 50% of that is going to occur on or near First Nations territories. So we've got to get these partnerships right. We've got to get the respect right if we're going to have the benefit of those resources. Now here's where the question is being posed that is the topic of this talk, is do oil sands cause health issues in First Nations? Now, as I said before, leading up to 2014, when this report came out, there were already existing health issues in First Nations across the country and as well in northern Alberta. Those health issues have existed for over 500 years in the form of cultural health issues, loss of identity, violence in the home, murder, suicide, things like that. A lot of these can be traced back to the legacy of the residential school system and the trauma suffered by the parents and grandparents of those that went to those schools. Regardless, for the last 20 years, First Nations have been complaining and noticing various situations in their communities that included cancer rates, toxic substances, and it was very difficult for the communities to draw attention to these issues. And so it finally happened in 2014. A very exhaustive and detailed report was done on whether there was health issues related to the oil sands of northern Alberta. The conclusion is yes. There is a definite link to what is happening in the oil sands and the downstream health effects of the First Nations living there. This was a very, as I said, very exhaustive study done by the National First Nation Environmental Contaminants Program in concert with Health Canada, a granting agency, and the affected First Nations. This is the study area. You'll see those two dots up in the northern part of the map, Fort McKay and Fort Chipewyan. They are the downstream communities of the oil sands of Alberta. You can see how large the oil sands area is of Canada. Not all of that land is being developed right now, but certainly large parts of it are under production, have been since the 1930s. And so those are the two communities that I'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. The health effects of the oil sands are conclusive and conclude that issues such as cancer, asthma, diabetes, mental illness, and the loss of access to country food and loss of cultural resilience are the main characteristics of the health issues that this study did find. It also noted that if we want to clean these issues up and make the oil sands a more sustainable, less polluting industry, it would cost over $250 billion for cleanup. Dr. Stefan McLaughlin was the lead investigator of this study, and in 2014 he said, "What we have found was decline in health, particularly in relation to cancer. Again, I would argue the link to oil sands is incontrovertible. So there is a definite link between oil sands releases and cancer rates in the First Nations communities." That individual in that picture there is quite a notable research scientist, David Schindler, from the University of Alberta. And he was for years trying to show governments of Canada that the oil sands releases were causing contaminants in the waterways to the point where many fish were developing lesions. And Dr. Schindler is showing to a committee the kinds of issues that fish and other wildlife were having as a result of living in these toxic environments. So the survey or the study concluded that these cancerous effects can be felt over 200 kilometers away from the communities. Cancer rates were 30% higher, and 20% of people involved in the studies have cancer. That's a very, very high and disturbing statistic. Some of the toxics, like arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and selenium, these are not surprising, but the report also noted that while some of the toxic loads were within thresholds, the issues of cumulative effects were the ones that is the issue that is of concern to the researchers, that over time, the low loading of these contaminants over time in various ways of concentrating them can cause the health issues which First Nations are experiencing today in the form of cancer. There was also some very strange findings, and Dr. Schindler was instrumental in discovering this. Up until that report was released, many people thought that the contaminants were only in the aquatic releases, just into the Athabasca River and various watersheds like that. But through Dr. Schindler's work and other researchers, they found that there was toxic loads in snow, and people were wondering, well, where are all these polycyclic aromatic compounds coming from? And it was coming from the airborne releases of the smelters and upgraders. And those releases were concentrating in rains and snows and falling downwind and concentrating in the snowpack. And so the conclusion is estimates of toxic loading has been underestimated by 2 times. Now, because of this, there's many, many indirect effects for First Nations. There is the direct effect of cancer and diabetes and that sort of thing. But because First Nations believe that the watersheds and the land is now essentially toxified, using country food which is a staple for First Nations in Canada, is a threat to their health. So foods such as moose, muskrat, various fish are not trusted and therefore not eaten as a protein source. Therefore, the only choice for protein and other foodstuffs is to buy from stores, which is very highly processed and very expensive food, leading to type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart issues. And because you can't hunt and because you can't pass on cultural knowledge to the youth, because of these fears of using country food, high rates of depression. But golden handcuffs. Jobs are important for First Nation communities, and most communities in Canada are not near urban centers, so they have to find ways of earning incomes other than going to cities. And if you're a remote community, this can prove to be very, very difficult. So Fort McKay is one of the communities that is in the middle of the oil sand development, and it has set up all kinds of service and supply companies to service the oil sand sector. And it's a very good business. Over $500 million has been generated in the last in 4 years from supply and services to the oil sand industry. I remember being in Fort McMurray, in the actual community of Fort McKay, doing a technical tour for IAIA a number of years ago at the Calgary conference. And I was talking to the cook who was serving up a traditional dinner for the guests who were doing this technical tour of the community. And he just sort of leaned back against the wall, and we were talking about the health issues and whether or not the cultural attributes of Fort McKay were going to survive over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And he said, it's all about the money. And he was benefiting from being a cook and providing services to the oil sand sector. But at the end of the day, it was all about the money. And he felt that it was going to be a very difficult challenge for his community to maintain cultural integrity while maintaining these jobs and incomes at the same time. However, there is indigenous action out there pushing for green energy and jobs, and the Indigenous Climate Action Group is pushing for green energy and jobs in northern Alberta. I hope I've made the case that there is a link to health issues from the oil sands in northern Alberta in the form of diabetes, cancer, depression, these sorts of things. And recently, just a few months ago, environmental governance in northern Alberta with respect to the oil sands is going to be relaxed. There's going to be 25% cut in monitoring outside of company oil leases. There's no field work on the Athabasca River or Wood Buffalo National Park, no field work on wetlands, no studies on fish, insects, mammals, birds, or amphibians, and a pilot project on tailing ponds risk has been dropped. Why is this? It's because of COVID-19. We're all experiencing lack of ability to do our jobs in the way we did prior to March. And the governments feel there is a risk to bringing people into various communities because of COVID-19. So there has been a relaxation of environmental governance in northern Alberta due to COVID-19. Is it permanent? We don't know. It's an evolving issue. What we do know is that the Athabasca River that flows through the oil sands of northern Alberta flows into the Northwest Territories of Canada, and Alberta has an agreement with the Northwest Territories to continue monitoring, but that monitoring has been relaxed. Politicians are watching this. The New Democratic Party environment critic, Marlon Schmidt, says it's critical to protect the environment. It's also critical to show the world we can develop these resources responsibly. We are failing at both. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about the oil sands. Companies are doing their best to develop technologies and monitoring programs to maintain a bit more of a sustainable approach to development, but this is proving very, very difficult today. In response to the pandemic, the federal government is going to release $82 million to help with mental health issues as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the issues stemming from the residential school system and the child welfare system. As I said before, over 160,000 students went to the residential schools in Canada, and the last residential school closed in 1996. And I mentioned the child welfare system because today there's 160,000 First Nation children, many from Northern Alberta, who are now in foster care homes because the parents have been deemed not suitable for caring for children because of perhaps residential school trauma and the challenges that they're facing. So those children have been taken out of their homes and placed in non-Indigenous homes. So basically, we've got the same problem happening again. In the 1880s and early 1900s, we had the residential school system taking kids away from their families. And today we have the child welfare system taking children away from their families. In the last few months, there's been 180% increase in calls for help from First Nations to the healthcare system, and overdose deaths in First Nations communities have doubled in British Columbia in the last few months. So those are just indicators of how stressed First Nations communities are as a result of the pandemic, and that is just an example of the delicate nature of First Nations communities and the trauma that they're suffering prior to the pandemic as a result of the legacy of the residential school system. So the relationship that they have with First Nations in Canada is the most important relationship. But I'd like to believe that, but there's still a lot of work to be done before this is proven. So in summary, are there health issues related to oil sands development in northern Canada? Well, the health issues and cultural issues that are there because of the residential school legacy already existed before the oil sands got developed. So there is a legacy of trauma and health issues from that. There was the confirmation of the 2014 oil sands report, which did make a link between oil sands toxic loads and cancers in First Nations communities. And we're also seeing increased mental health issues from the pandemic, climate change, cultural erosion, and loss of access to country food. So all of this to say that there are many, many health issues in Northern Alberta stemming from these three areas. There's a lot to do in Canada to address First Nations issues with respect to health. And the Government of Canada, the Government of Alberta, all the governments of Canada are trying in their own way to meet these challenges, but the pandemic has certainly amplified these challenges and has put in place some restrictions to putting programs and people on the ground to help address them in a very concrete way. However, I'm hopeful that once we get through this pandemic, the monitoring programs can resume, and if we call a new normal, or whatever it's going to be, that some of these health concerns of First Nations can be addressed in a more practical and I hope successful way. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned a few things about this. It's not all happy news, but that is the state of play with respect to First Nations and oil sands development in Canada. Excuse me. I hope to hear from you. If you have questions, please send them to me, and you have my email right there. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Dan Stuckless, and I am the Executive Director for the Fort McKay Métis Nation in Fort McKay, Alberta. It is a small Indigenous hamlet and reserve that has First Nation people and Métis people living alongside each other, and it's primarily made up of Cree, Dene, and Métis people. They're a traditional community, and I've worked for this community years ago when I represented both nations working in one organization, and now just exclusively the Métis Nation. I was asked and approached by IAIA to talk about how the recent changes to monitoring legislation in Alberta and in Canada due to COVID-19 had the potential to impact the community that I work for. It was a little bit of a shock when the announcement came out. We were notified in different parts of April and May as these decisions were made. And I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the work that the community did to sort out what that looked like, to try and understand those decisions, to try and provide input into those decisions, and ultimately to call out the incorrectness that was made alongside in those decisions. So let me first go back to about February, before the pandemic was declared in Canada. And that was when we were starting to hear what was happening in other places. The first signs, I think, by that time had shown up in the US. And we had already started to encounter really catastrophic oil prices, and particularly in this region where I'm sitting at ground zero of Canada's oil sands development, which is upward of 250 million or billion barrels of oil in a sand deposit that's extracted and forms the largest part of Canada's oil industry. So we did get notice that some of the industries were having a lot of trouble with global prices, and some companies across our country and in North America were starting to become less viable and were starting to be in trouble. So we were aware of lobbying efforts back in February by the various lobbying groups for the oil and gas companies to try and get some reprieve on some of their environmental monitoring commitments, approval conditions. So without having any really discussions with the First Nations or with the Métis Nations in and around the oil sands, we found this really a little surprising. If you don't know a lot about Canadian law, Indigenous people's rights are protected in the Constitution. There is a duty to consult when the Crown is considering potential impacts to those rights. And there's a varying degree of interpretation and how that's applied within Canada. I like to tell people that we have a two-tier system for Section 35 rights in Canada, and that Alberta typically is about 30 years behind the other provinces who have more progressive regimes about how they consult and where they consult. In Alberta, we have to fight for, still have to fight for a spot at the table to be consulted on energy development. And even when the duty does apply, the scope of that duty is quite limited, and we think incorrectly applied. So that being said, going back to February, we were aware of the efforts because really due to low commodity prices, not so much the pandemic at the time. Fast forward a month later, in the middle of March, Canada declares the pandemic as a result of the coronavirus, and we, like many places in the country, shut down offices and started to do things a little differently remotely, while we waited for direction from health authorities. Health authority acts kicked in, etc. Later in the pandemic, however, we did get some clarity from at least Alberta's chief medical officer, and that was around what was considered essential services. And at that time, environmental monitoring for the protection of health and safety was listed as an essential service. However, there still were continuing efforts based on low commodity prices, now even lower, affected by less demand, where we had continued lobbying efforts at the end of March for, again, now shifting from low commodity prices and reprieve on environmental monitoring to citing issues with social distancing and inability to have multiple people on site and limiting access to the sites by companies for reasons to, again, get some reprieve on the type of monitoring that would need to be done. All of which does make sense in of itself, except the driver really seemed to be the economic component of it, not so much the coronavirus concerns, because the other activities that were occurring on site that were either as much risk or considered higher risk weren't being affected. Transportation to and from site, the use of airplanes for fly in, fly out, staying in camps in the same amount of numbers. But when it came to compliance monitoring and those kind of things, those types of activities were found out to be mainly done by consultants and contractors that didn't live in the vicinity of these projects, or were done by universities or university students who weren't going to be traveling for to do the work that they needed to do on site. So that was really eye-opening for us to see how the virus and the impact of the virus was manipulated to really avoid certain parameters in the environmental monitoring, and how easy it was for proponents to just make a phone call or send a note to a regulator and have those kind of exemptions provided without really any discussion with stakeholders who, more so in the pandemic, were not going to grocery stores, but going to the land more, and where they felt it was safe. There was even ideas of the community that I work for moving, people to be more isolated in the bush at bush camps on reserve or at lodges and cabins. And so land use activity actually increased. And at a time when, in this region, there's a major river that runs right through the deposit that has a lot of traditional land use value from cultural aspects or from traditional land use types of perspectives for fishing or for transportation. And the Canadian government wanted to do away with some of the autonomous monitoring that was going to be done on that river, which again didn't make any sense. Had we had a conversation with both the federal government and the provincial government, we likely would have come to the same understanding. That precautions needed to be taken, people needed to be protected. But it was we would have been a part of an inclusive discussion on the appropriateness for that action, rather than a decision made with not a lot of backup, not a lot of rationale, and even conflicting information coming from what the Crown had said was the rationale for the decisions and what the chief medical officer had recommended as far as action or requirements around safety, environmental management, safety of people and resources. So we did take exception to it. We were looking at our options. A number of First Nation and Métis communities in this region decided to take different actions. Some had requested meetings with the Crown, some had sent letters in, and some of them actually took legal action or attempted to take legal action. With all of the mounting pressure and the conflicting information that was really out there, in and about the end of May, we started to hear that the 90-day pandemic order in the province was going to be coming to an end at the same time as some of these provisions were going to take place. So it didn't make sense to us that we were going to end and allowing people to kind of go back to work, to lift the restrictions, to start easing back into a new phase in response to the pandemic, and at the same time march forward these restrictions, some of which were vitally important. And I'll draw your attention to one of the restrictions or exemptions that companies were asking for were around groundwater monitoring wells in and around the tailings areas. And we now know from reports that were released in the last month or so that some of these tailings ponds deposits have been running into the river through groundwater sources for a long time. And so, when you're working for a community that already has not necessarily trusted the regulator or the decisions that were made that are not nearly made or not normally made in the best interest of the community or protection of their rights or their health, you have decisions like this that are made that further that gap and further that mistrust. And it was just the wrong way to go when you're trying to establish yourself as a world-class monitoring system or a world-class regulator, and you can just have a proponent who is regulated by this group and make a phone call and have some of these approvals changed with not a lot of effort or not a lot of backup. So, I think if there had been a discussion with people in a reasonable way, we probably would have come to some sort of compromising and some sort of conclusion that allowed for a reduction of activity, which was probably prudent in the situation, but ones that would have held the line on really the key important part. And I can't stress enough the one that comes to mind is the Athabasca River itself, and how the monitoring requirements for both at the project level and at the regional level for the system was considered to be non-essential. That's a river system that has drinking water sources on it. It leads to a sensitive ecosystem downstream. It's heavily relied on by indigenous people in the region. And for lots of reasons, it just didn't make any sense at all. I can say, luckily, from that point forward, we did get notification from the government after much pressure that the restrictions were going to be reinstated and the expectations changed. But I don't think that would have happened without the public outcry that we've got from the indigenous communities here and the environmental allies on some of these things that really pushed the public spotlight onto these missteps by the regulator and the provincial and federal government. And just a reminder that, as part of the impact assessment process, that these are mitigation measures, whether they're the right ones or not, they're heavily relied on and become an important part of feeding information to and providing a level of comfort and safety and trust in the system when there's they become the last line of defense to making sure that projects are not having unintended consequences as a result of development, and particularly the really tough to manage in this area cumulative effects that occur on this landscape where you have a dozen mining companies at one time, and other types of industrial development all going on in one area. It becomes really hard to treat it like it was a one source type of impact to manage, when it really is a checkerboard of types of projects that are more difficult to manage at a larger scale. So we were lucky that the monitoring provisions were reinstated and that everything was normal, I think, by about the end of August. But had we not said anything, we feel like that would have gone on probably longer. And it really sets a bad precedence in the province on how easily with, some conflict, whether it's global commodity prices, whether it's a pandemic, or whether it's, the monitoring efforts are really tough because it's in a tough landscape, can be changed, with low-level staff at just requiring a couple of emails and working out something, when we have this, extensive permitting process and assessment process built into these decisions. When it comes to Indigenous communities and Section 35 rights, it doesn't speak well to the Honour of the Crown, which Alberta had just received a really damning report from a major court talking about the Honour of the Crown and how to work with Indigenous communities and to how to reconcile interests, and then to see this decision made on the heels of that decision was just super disappointing. So with that, I just want to let you know that I think we're all doing relatively well here in the community. We have had cases of COVID-19 in the community. The community has gated itself off with restrictions in order to keep all of the members safe, and particularly the elders in the community. And we're doing the best we can. And so far, we've been lucky to not lose anybody as a result of the virus, but we've had a couple of cases that we were able to act on quickly. And leadership on behalf of both communities should be applauded for the effort that they have really done in keeping the community here in Fort McKay safe. So thank you very much.